Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 15 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to those two positions, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 15. After which, I'll transition to talking about my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Before we get into today's content, a couple reminders. If you guys are looking for my thoughts on a specific tight end or quarterback, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with a singular purpose of trying to help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. This upcoming Saturday and Sunday, I'll be live streaming on both mornings starting at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you have any questions before kickoff, be sure to swing on by. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about tight end matchups for Week 15. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 tight end receiving statistics allowed. This is receiving statistics isolated in terms of receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or even a full PPR league. Now, of course, we want to take advantage of these advantageous matchups. The Cincinnati Bengals, New Orleans Saints, Denver Broncos, Los Angeles Rams, between the spectrum of time from weeks 5 through 14, they have allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. So, of course, if you have studs, you want to play them against these overall tight end matchups. But if you're streaming a tight end, you also might want to go ahead and take advantage of these advantageous matchups. Now, some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into the given week follow as such. The Tennessee Titans at the very bottom of this list, with the New York Giants, Cleveland Browns, Kansas City Chiefs. Now, it's not impossible to succeed within these overall matchups, but it is difficult. A lot of these teams just generally haven't played against stud tight ends. Therefore, these numbers are far lower than where they actually should be, near the average across the league, which is 9 to 10 points on a per weekly basis. Now, with that all covered, let's go ahead and transition into talking about tight ends. I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. But before we hop into my top 16 tight end rankings, do not forget that rankings are subject to change. There's a reason why I stream every single weekend, is because rankings always change because of injury information and stuff that is made public. Therefore, by the time we get to Saturday and Sunday, these rankings could potentially change. So for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to travel down to the description and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, and for the next 2 weekends, every single Saturday morning as well, because of course there are Saturday games. So go ahead, take advantage of the opportunity. These rankings are by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR and full PPR, rankings that are not provided on a weekly basis throughout this overall channel. So take advantage of the opportunity today by checking out the map to the right side of the screen, determining your eligibility based on your current location, signing up using code Andrew, and making that first time deposit minimum of $10. And if you do so before tonight's game between the Los Angeles Chargers and of course Las Vegas Raiders, you can go ahead and take advantage of the new customer special in regards to pick and plays in terms of Austin Eckler going higher than 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's talk about the tight end position for Week 15. Beginning with the Kelce tier, we have Travis Kelce. 4 consecutive games of over 10 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. In comparison to seasons past, of course, this is an underwhelming side of Travis Kelce, but we'll take it. At this current moment in time, we'll take as many fantasy points as we can possibly get in order to help us capture a championship. Eventually, he's going to have himself a breakout performance. Hopefully, an angry Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce can take out their frustrations on the Patriots defense, which has not played well at all this season. My hope would be that Travis Kelce finds himself an upside performance in far more than 11, 12 fantasy points like he's done over the course of the last 4 games. On number 2 is George Kittle, who's been playing extremely well over the course of the last couple weeks. In fact, in the last 7 games, between weeks 7 through 14, he's been averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game. And in 5 of the last 7 games he has played, he has scored over 10 fantasy points. This week, he takes on the Arizona Cardinals. It is an advantageous matchup. Over the course of the last couple weeks, the Arizona Cardinals have given up, 4 catches, 40 yards, and a receiving touchdown to Mark Andrews. 4 catches, 26 yards, and a touchdown to David Njoku. 2 catches, 32, and a touchdown to Dalton Schultz. 5 receptions, 29 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns to Tyler Higbee. Down in the red zone, where, of course, George Kittle has his most potential for upside, a lot of tight ends have found a lot of success against the Arizona Cardinals, so why not George Kittle this week? Our number 3 is TJ Hockenson. Now, we just spoke about George Kittle, and him and TJ Hockenson have a lot in common. Of course, first and foremost, they went to the same school in college. Of course, tight end university. Both of them have played extremely well in the National Football League. But going into this week, TJ Hockenson will play with a quarterback that, of course, George Kittle is very familiar with, Nick Mullins. Nick Mullins last week after he came in the relief of Joshua Dobbs, had 13 total passing attempts, 4 in the direction of TJ Hockenson for 4 receptions, 45 receiving yards, and a 31% target share. The reason why I bring up the entire conversation of Nick Mullins and, of course, playing with George Kittle in the past, if you go back to the early days of George Kittle's overall career, specifically in his second season, with Nick Mullins, George Kittle was able to, put up the record for most receiving yards by a tight end within a singular season in that year. Obviously, it was later broken by Travis Kelce, but nonetheless, there is a lot of potential for TJ Hockenson to get himself a vast majority over the overall targets within this offense, on top of the fact that, of course, Justin Jefferson dealing with an injury, and the tight end position typically within this offense is the safety blanket. They take on the most advantageous matchup going into the week, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. TJ Hawkinson's to have himself a fantastic performance. Our number 4 for this week, to close out the A tier, is Trey McBride, coming off of the bye week, but prior to his bye week, in the last 4 games he has played with Kyler Murray at quarterback, weeks 10 through 13, he's averaging 8.5 targets per game, 7 receptions per game, 81 receiving yards, and has scored 1 receiving touchdown in the last 4 games he has played with Kyler Murray, averaging 13.08 half PPR fantasy points per game. I understand it is a difficult matchup taking on the San Francisco 49ers, but the expectation is that, of course, Kyler Murray and the Arizona Cardinals will have to throw for the entirety of this game. And considering he prefers Trey McBride as a red zone target, last time out, of course, found him in the end zone against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and considering they're going to be trailing for a majority of this game taking on the San Francisco 49ers, there should be a lot of passing attempts and a lot of targets going in the direction of Trey McBride. Our number 5 to begin the B tier is Sam LaPorta. Now, Sam LaPorta in 2 of the last 4 games has played against the Chicago Bears. In both of those games, very underwhelming performances, primarily because Jared Goff has turned over the ball 5 times in the last 2 games against the Chicago Bears in terms of interceptions. But in those performances, Sam LaPorta, 3.7 and 5.3 fantasy points. The 2 other games that he has performed over the course of the last 4 weeks, 15.2, 24.5. I truly do believe that the Chicago Bears are the kryptonite of the Detroit Lions offense, and specifically Jared Goff, going into this weekend's matchup against the Denver Broncos, which is the 3rd best matchup at the tight end position, allowing 12.8 fantasy points per game since week 5 to opposing tight ends. I expect Sam LaPorta to get back on track and have himself another explosive performance here. Our number 6, we have Evan Engram. Man, Evan Engram, he went 11 games this season without scoring a touchdown. And in the last 2 games, he has scored 3 total touchdowns. He's been able to put up, 18 fantasy points and 27 fantasy points the last 2 weeks. Incredible numbers. He's coming off a performance in which he had 12 targets, 11 receptions, 95 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. In comparison to Calvin Ridley, who had himself, 13 targets and 4 receptions. Same thing with Zay Jones, 14 targets, 5 receptions, something of that nature. When we compare their overall opportunities to Evan Engram, it's very similar. All double digits within the category. But the fact of the matter is, Evan Engram is delivering as of late. The last 2 weeks, 21 targets, 20 receptions, 177 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. He has a lot of momentum. He takes on the Baltimore Ravens this week in a game in which they should be throwing for majority of the game. Moving on to our number 7, we have David Njoku. Going into week 14, Joe Flacco and David Njoku finally found their connection. Of course, David Njoku targeted 8 times, 6 receptions, 91 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 24 plus fantasy points. Incredible overall game. And going forward, we're going to continue to see this level of involvement. Like I've mentioned in the past, the Cleveland Browns over the course of the last 9 games have targeted their tight ends 10 plus times per game on average. So if they're going to continue to look in the direction of David Njoku, all while throwing the ball 44 plus times each of the last 2 games, I'm expecting a high volume of overall targets in the direction of David Njoku in a game in which they're taking on the Chicago Bears, who are allowing over 10 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends since week 5. Moving on to our number 8. We have Jake Ferguson. Jake Ferguson in the last 2 games has had himself over 70 receiving yards in both contests. Incredible overall production, but there is some inconsistencies in regards to the potential of Jake Ferguson. There are going to be games in which he has lackluster performances and he's not utilized to a high capacity, but over the course of the last 7 games in specific, he has scored 4 receiving touchdowns. As long as you're associated with a high-level offense like the Dallas Cowboys, who are scoring 30 plus points in 7 of the last 8 games they have played as an offense. The only game in which they weren't able to do so was a couple weeks back against the Philadelphia Eagles. Even in that game, they should have had themselves over 30 points. Obviously a couple close calls there in terms of 2-point conversions and touchdowns, but nonetheless, Jake Ferguson, associated with one of the higher scoring offenses in the National Football League. Jake Ferguson will always be implicated to potentially score a touchdown, and on top of it, if his target count continues to rise, the yardage is always going to be there. Moving on to our number 9, we have Isaiah Likely of the Baltimore Ravens, coming off a great performance. Again, last week, a lot of tight ends scored touchdowns. Unlikely tight ends, pun intended, but either way, Isaiah Likely, 5 receptions, 83 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown. He takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars this upcoming week. Last week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, of course, David Njoku, 6 receptions, 91 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 24 plus fantasy points. In the last 5 starts that Isaiah likely has had throughout his career, going back to 2022 and this season, where Mark Andrews has been out, and of course Isaiah likely was the primary starter, he's been averaging 9.2 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting that level of production, and if he scores a touchdown, of course, 16 fantasy points is on the table. Moving on to our number 10, we have Dalton Kincaid. Of course, he's coming off of the injury that he sustained last week, but it didn't limit his overall opportunity and his overall potential for snaps and success. Last week, he was still able to get himself 8 total targets in comparison to Dawson Knox, who finally returned. He played 80% of the offensive snaps, while Dawson Knox played 47%. So if we're going to be in a position in which, of course, now we've had the shift within this overall offense, where Dalton Kincaid is the primary tight end in comparison to earlier this season, where Dawson Knox was playing the vast majority of the overall snaps and getting the vast majority of targets, I would assume that Dalton Kincaid can continue to have his similar value. But the only thing that's potentially holding him back is touchdown upside. Going into this week against the Dallas Cowboys, we have seen tight ends find a lot of success within the overall matchup. We just have to hope that Dalton Kincaid can get implicated within a shootout here and find himself in the end zone. Our number 11 is Dallas Goedert. Dallas Goedert, of course, coming back from his injury last week, had himself limited overall utilization, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 30 receiving yards. But this week, he takes on the Seattle Seahawks. It's one of the more advantageous matchups you can possibly ask for. Most recently against the Seattle Seahawks, we have seen tight ends like George Kittle, 3 catches, 76 and a touchdown. Jake Ferguson, 6 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Mark Andrews, 9 catches for 80. David Njoku, 4 catches, 77 and a touchdown. It's the 9th best matchup at the position, and stud tight ends continue to deliver within the overall game. I expect Dallas Goedert to be the next within that overall conversation. My number 12 for this week is Cole Kmet. He's coming off another solid performance in which he's got 7 total targets, 5 receptions, 66 receiving yards. That is a great overall game, especially considering he didn't even score a touchdown. 9.1 fantasy points. We'll take that every single week from him. This week he takes on the Cleveland Browns. Typically this is a difficult matchup, but what we saw last week from Evan Engram, getting himself 11 receptions, 12 targets, 95 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns, there is a potential for Cole Kmet to be able to deliver a high volume performance. It's just a matter of, is he going to get the opportunity down in the red zone? Of course, last week we saw both Justin Fields and DJ Moore score rushing touchdowns, so that obviously went ahead and limited the potential of opportunities that Cole Kmet was going to get down into the red zone. But going into this week's matchup, I truly do believe that if a guy like Denzel Ward is active and it's going to limit the potential upside of DJ Moore, the number 2 option within this offense, within the receiving game, is immediately Cole Kmet based on target opportunity and, of course, success. Down in the red zone should be a stud option. Hopefully can find himself a touchdown this week. Our number 13 is Dalton Schultz. Under the assumption that, of course, CJ Stroud is healthy and playing, even against the most difficult matchup at the position, I would fire up Dalton Schultz in a heartbeat. But if, in fact, it's going to be Davis Mills going into this weekend and CJ Stroud is not able to clear the concussion protocol, I'll probably move him down a couple ranks. But we know how much success he has found when he has been healthy thus far this season. He's averaging over 11 fantasy points per game in the last 7 games he has played. He has scored a lot of touchdowns throughout that span of time. Some caught from, of course, CJ Stroud, some caught from Devin Singletary. But either way, he's been a huge option within this red zone offense. And going forward, in the absence of Tank Dell and potentially Nico Collins, could have himself a lot of upside with CJ Stroud if available. Number 14, we have Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts scored himself a touchdown last week. Now, I wasn't expecting Kyle Pitts to score a touchdown, but we'll take it. Back-to-back weeks of 50-plus receiving yards. We most recently heard prior to these 50-yard receiving games that, of course, a guy like Arthur Smith, the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, believed that Kyle Pitts is a huge part of this offense. Hopefully, they continue the streak of success. I know that 50 yards at the tight end position is not a huge number, but for Kyle Pitts, it's progress. Our number 15 for this week is Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin, in the last 3 full games he has played with Zach Wilson, where Zach Wilson was the starter from beginning to end, he has scored 9.6, 10.5, and 7.7 fantasy points. If we're going to continue that streak of success where he's getting himself 4+ receptions and over 57 receiving yards in 6 of the last 7 games he has played with Zach Wilson, of course, he's a top 15 option at the tight end position. On top of it, we'll always have touchdown upside within the red zone. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention at the tight end position. In terms of my top 16 rankings, we have Logan Thomas. He takes on the Rams. It's the 4th best matchup at the position. We've seen a lot of success against this defense from tight ends over the course of the season. And of course, most recently, Isaiah likely was able to score himself a touchdown and score over 16 fantasy points. Coming off of the bye week, I'm sure they're prepared to take advantage and exploit this overall matchup. Now, a couple other tight ends that I wanted to mention as honorable mentions that I did not have in the top 16 rankings are guys like Pat Freiermuth, Tucker Kraft, Chigoziem Okonkwo, and K. Dotton. do not be afraid of starting these tight ends. They all have extremely advantageous matchups going into the given week, but in comparison to the other tight ends that I've mentioned, they just don't have as much potential for upside. All right, let's move on to the quarterback conversation, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have our 2023 quarterback passing statistics allowed. We've gone ahead and isolated passing yards, passing touchdowns, and interceptions from weeks 5 through 14 in order to determine that the Washington Commanders, Philadelphia Eagles, Jacksonville Jaguars, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Detroit Lions, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the quarterback position in terms of passing statistics. Now, of course, this isn't implicating the potential for rushing yards and any sort of rushing statistics that you'll be able to find. So, guy like Lamar Jackson taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, the third most advantageous matchup at the position, should be expected to find himself a lot of success within the passing game, but on top of it, gain the rushing yards, the rushing touchdowns, and have an even more explosive performance within the overall week. Now, some of the more disadvantageous matchups at the position, of course, as we all know, the New York Jets play extremely well against opposing quarterbacks over this entire season, but as of late, of course, have been locking down quarterbacks. The Las Vegas Raiders, they'll play tonight. The Las Vegas Raiders defense is not a bad idea, especially considering Justin Herbert and, of course, Keenan Allen are both out. Keep that in mind for those of you who are streaming defenses. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics. We'll transition into talking about my top 16 quarterbacks right now. I'll refer back to these numbers as we progress throughout the course of today's video. But let's go ahead and begin with our number one at the quarterback position for Week 15. It is Jalen Hurts taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Last week, Jalen Hurts scored 0 touchdowns. That's the second time over the course of the last 2 seasons in which Jalen Hurts has not scored a touchdown within a singular game. Very seldom do we ever see that. And thank goodness for that. I mean, as of late, we had seen, Jalen Hurts racking up an 8 consecutive game streak of scoring 2 or more touchdowns. As long as we get back to that overall potential, taking on the Seattle Seahawks this week, a defense and a team that is on a 4-game losing streak, primarily because their defense isn't playing well. We've seen quarterbacks like Sam Howell go for 312 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. Dak Prescott, 299 and 3 passing touchdowns. Brock Purdy, 368 and 2 passing touchdowns. There is a lot of success to be found here. I expect Jalen Hurts to, of course, light up the Seattle Seahawks secondary. Moving on to Dak Prescott, our number 2, who's been playing extremely well. Speaking of consecutive games of scoring a touchdown, 2+ touchdowns in the last 8 consecutive games within this offense. Of course, obviously coming off the bye week, has been on fire and, of course, leading the National Football League in terms of total passing touchdowns. In 6 of the last 7 games, the Dallas Cowboys team has scored 30 or more points. They're lighting up the scoreboard, and the implication going into this weekend's game against the Buffalo Bills is 50.5 points via Vegas in terms of total points scored. So under the assumption that this is going to be a game in which the Dallas Cowboys go out and score another 30 points and end up pulling out a victory against the Buffalo Bills in a potential shootout, I would anticipate Dak Prescott probably 270 to 300 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns minimum, and of course another solid performance against this defense. If we can get a shootout similar to the way in which the Philadelphia Eagles played against the Buffalo Bills a couple weeks back, it'd be even better for the upside of Dak Prescott. The final quarterback I wanted to mention, speaking of the Buffalo Bills, is Josh Allen. Josh Allen has scored 10 rushing touchdowns in the last 11 games he has played this season. Like I mentioned with James Cook every single week, James Cook is not expected to score touchdowns. It is all about Josh Allen and down in the red zone. Now, recently, over the course of the last 2 games, of course, since the change of the offensive coordinator, now who is currently Joe Brady, we have seen far more rushing potential from Josh Allen in comparison to earlier this season. In the last 2 games, of his 19 overall rushing attempts, 10 of them are designed runs in comparison to 9 of them being scrambles. When you're getting Josh Allen far more involved within design runs, similar to a guy like Justin Fields as of late, it increases their potential for upside, not only just on yardage alone, but of course implementation down in the red zone in order to find themselves scoring a touchdown every single week, as of course Josh Allen has been able to do. In 12 consecutive games, he has scored 2 or more touchdowns. If this is going to be a shootout, it only helps him. Moving on to the A tier, we have Lamar Jackson. Sunday morning of last week, we were all worried about the weather. And luckily, about 20 to 15 minutes before the game, we checked the social medias. We saw it's not really raining. Okay, let's go ahead and let's rank Lamar Jackson far higher than where we had him, assuming the game was going to be a complete weather drought, and it wasn't. And luckily, we went ahead and fired up Lamar Jackson because he's coming off of his best performance since week 7, in which he scored 31.64 fantasy points, over 300 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 70 rushing yards on 11 rushing attempts, continues to get it done on the ground through the air, and finally has found himself a little bit of a resurgence in the absence of Mark Andrews. Hopefully we're going to continue this streak, especially taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 3rd best matchup at the position. Number 5, we have Brock Purdy, who's coming off another consistent performance. I mean, this is 4 of the last 5 games in which he's been able to produce 2 or more touchdowns scored. On top of it, Loki had himself 368 passing yards. That's the 12th most passing yards in a single game by a quarterback this season. If you're going to produce those kind of numbers against the Seattle Seahawks when they have Drew Lock at their quarterback, I mean, it's always possible for him to light up this Arizona Cardinals defense and put up a huge number. Last time out against the Arizona Cardinals in week 4, in that game in which Christian McCaffrey had 3 rushing touchdowns, Brock Purdy still had over 21 fantasy points, had himself 283 passing yards, a rushing touchdown, and a passing touchdown. There's a lot of potential here within the given week for another consistent performance. On number 6, we have Matthew Stafford, who has been playing out of his mind as of late. In the last 3 games, 10 passing touchdowns, only 1 interception. As an offense, this team has been able to score 30-plus points in each of the last 3 games. They are lighting up these opposing defenses, taking on defenses like the Cleveland Browns and Baltimore Ravens. So I think the Washington Commanders are going to be a walk in the park for the Los Angeles Rams offense. The Commanders are the best matchup at the quarterback position. They're allowing 21.49 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks since week 5. My expectation is Matthew Stafford 2+, maybe even 3+ passing touchdowns within the given week. Moving on to our number 7. On the other side of this overall matchup, to begin the B tier, we have the angry bird himself, Sam Howell. Sam Howell, thus far this season, leads the National Football League in terms of total passing attempts and completions. He's top 5 in terms of passing yardage and continues to deliver in negative game scripts. And luckily, over the course of the last couple weeks, despite the fact that his overall passing success has not been there due to the difficult matchups, he has scored 4 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games. Now, for the sake of Brian Robinson Jr. and his overall fantasy success, it truly has limited him, but Sam Howell continues to deliver for fantasy purposes. A top option within this overall prospect. I mean, he is averaging more fantasy points per game than Patrick Mahomes this season. We're absolutely firing him up against the Los Angeles Rams defense. Now, speaking of Patrick Mahomes, who is scoring less fantasy points per game thus far this season in comparison to Sam Howell, can hopefully get himself back on track. I mean, truly, as of late, Patrick Mahomes has been struggling. Coming off a week in which he had a 58% passing completion percentage is not going to cut it. We need a revenge tour here. We need him and Travis Kelce to dominate against these defenses. The fact that Mitchell Trubisky was able to score 20.6 fantasy points last Thursday against the New England Patriots defense, I would assume that Patrick Mahomes should very easily be able to put up very similar numbers, be able to at least surpass 20 fantasy points within a given game. If he's not able to within an advantageous matchup as such, then of course we're going to suffer because of it. But in many of our scenarios, we have to start Patrick Mahomes. Our number 9 for this week is Justin Fields, coming off another great performance in which, of course, he had himself 24.72 fantasy points. Another great week in which he found himself a lot of success in terms of rushing statistics against the Detroit Lions. But since returning from injury, this guy's been lighting it up in terms of rushing opportunities. He has had himself quite literally 42 rushing attempts in the last 3 games. 30 of those overall 42 rushing attempts, rushes by design, whether they are, quarterback powers, quarterback sweeps, read option keeps. All of these overall rushing attempts are designed for Justin Fields to keep the ball and dominate on the ground. When you're able to find enough success on the ground, it is going to make up for any sort of inefficiencies he has through the air, even taking on the Cleveland Browns secondary. I do anticipate for Justin Fields to continue to dominate on the ground, and with that overall potential as a baseline, anything he does through the air in terms of the passing game is going to be gravy. Hopefully, for his sake and DJ Moore's sake, Denzel Ward is inactive this week, but time will tell in regards to his overall injury. Moving on to our number 10, we have Jordan Love. To close out the B tier, Jordan Love takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That is quite literally the 4th best matchup at the position. There's a reason why Desmond Ridder was one of the top 3 quarterbacks last week in fantasy football, and it's because he took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So hopefully Jordan Love will have all of his receiving weapons surrounding him healthy and ready to go, like Aaron Jones and Christian Watson. But if in fact they're not, I still believe that the matchup itself is an advantageous one. And if Jordan Love can start hot early, and of course not sputter early in the first half like he did last week against the New York Giants, he should be able to find far more success and of course take advantage of the matchup. On number 11 is Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson's been playing extremely well. 5 of the last 6 games with 2 or more touchdowns scored. Since week 5, of course, the Detroit Lions secondary and defense has allowed over 15.4 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. It's the 5th best matchup at the position throughout that span of time. My assumption is another great performance here out of Russell Wilson. Last week, only had himself 6 rushing attempts for 5 rushing yards. Typically, over the course of the last month, has found far more success on the ground. I do expect those rushing numbers to increase this week, especially considering it's going to be a far more competitive matchup in comparison to the lead that they sustained against the Los Angeles Chargers last week. Our number 12 to close out the QB1 conversation is Trevor Lawrence. Even with a hobbled ankle, this guy was able to show up, put up 250 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. I understand he threw 3 interceptions, but it is the nature of the beast. It happens. Either way, hopefully by the time we get to Sunday's game against the Baltimore Ravens, he will be healthy. I mean, we just saw Matthew Stafford light up this defense for 3 passing touchdowns and over 250 yards. So if we're going to be in a very similar conversation in which Trevor Lawrence is going to put the secondary to the test with all the injuries that they have sustained as of late, Trevor Lawrence should be a solid play within the given week, assuming he's healthy and ready to go. Moving on to our number 13, we have Jake Browning, who's played extremely well as of late. In the last 3 games, of his 87 overall passing attempts, only 18 incompletions. That's a 79.3% completion percentage, which is a ridiculous number. He has scored 5 touchdowns in the last 2 games, 2 of which have been rushing touchdowns. As long as he's continuing to ball out, he's a starting option within the given week. For the volume of fantasy points he has scored over the course of the last 2 games, he really has gotten to the point of where he is filling in for Joe Burrow perfectly. I understand this is a difficult matchup against Brian Flores and that Minnesota Vikings defense, but I do expect Jake Browning to find success once again. On number 14 is Jared Goff. Jared Goff, again, as of late against the Chicago Bears, has struggled mightily. 5 interceptions thrown in their direction. In comparison to all the other games he's played this season, he only has 5 interceptions total. So I'm going to go ahead and say the Chicago Bears were his kryptonite. Taking on the Denver Broncos this week, should get back on track, should get back to being a 240 passing yard quarterback, 2 passing touchdowns, and having a solid overall performance. On number 15, we have Joe Flacco. I mean, I have to suggest him at this point. This offense is throwing the ball 44 and 45 times over the course of the last 2 games. He continues to get himself a lot of opportunity, and he is delivering. Coming off a week in which he had 311 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns against the Jacksonville Jaguars. A far more advantageous overall matchup, but taking on the Chicago Bears should be a walk in the park, considering how great the run-stop defense is for the Bears. So it should lead to a lot of play-action opportunities for Joe Flacco, looking in the direction of guys like David Njoku, of course, Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, etc. He's got the weapons. He's got the offense to surround him. He should continue to put up great performances. Our number 16 is Tua Tagovailoa. I understand he's a very difficult matchup against the New York Jets, but not only that, he has a lot of injuries to his offensive line. Tyreek Hill's dealing with an injury, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not Devon Achane is even going to play this week. Therefore, Tua Tagovailoa, last time out against this defense, had himself 2 interceptions, didn't play particularly well. I would potentially say that this is a guy that we might want to sit in comparison to alternative options, but if he's your best available quarterback, fire him up and hope for the best. Now, I wanted to also mention an honorable mention in terms of our number 17. If, in fact, Geno Smith is going to be available, I would probably have him ranked higher than Tua and Joe Flacco. Just wanted to mention him because I don't know whether or not he is going to be available dealing with the groin injury, but taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, the second best matchup at the position since week 5, I would assume that Geno Smith healthy with all the weapons that he has to his disposal. I mean, guys like DK Metcalf, JSN, Tyler Lockett against this secondary that has struggled so mightily against opposing wide receivers. I would assume that Geno Smith, if healthy, would have himself a fantastic day within the overall matchup. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of my overall rankings for week 15. Let's go ahead and transition into talking about some underdog pick'ems for tonight's game before closing out today's video. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. So going into tonight's game, of course, we know that Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen are both out. So my favorite plays going into tonight's game, assuming you don't take advantage of the 0.5 total yards from Austin Eckler in tonight's matchup, I really do like the idea of him either going higher on his overall reception count or going higher on his overall receiving yards. I'll take the receiving yard count here. I think receptions 5 or more is definitely in the realm of possibility, but 29.5 receiving yards could very easily be accomplished on one singular play. So I'll go ahead, I'll take the idea of a couple screen passes going in his direction, or of course him becoming a check down king within the overall matchup and being able to gather up a lot of overall receiving yards based on the fact that, again, with no Keenan Allen there, the security blanket within this offense is going to be Austin Eckler. Now, if we were to go ahead and put together a pick'em slip, and I wanted to mention a player from the opposing team, the player that I feel most confident rolling with is potentially Aiden O'Connell in terms of going higher on his overall completions with 19.5. Over the course of the last 3 games, he has 21, 23, and 24 passing completions. I would assume that he'll go ahead and continue to throw the ball, especially if, in fact, Josh Jacobs is not going to be playing this game. When I scroll down, I don't see any Josh Jacobs plays here because the assumption is that he is most likely not going to play in tonight's game. So I would lean towards the idea of him being able to throw the ball for majority of the game, getting a lot of utilization out of someone like Amir Abdullah within the receiving game. And not only that, guys like, of course, Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, Hunter Renfrow, etc. Guys like Michael Mayer, all those guys implicated within the overall role. So those are the 2 plays that I would suggest going into tonight's game. going higher on the receiving yards of Austin Eckler, and going higher on the completions of Aiden O'Connell. There are many other plays that you could take advantage of, so go ahead, travel down to the description, check out Underdog Fantasy, use code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10. If you deposit 10, you'll get 10. If you deposit 100, you'll get 100 within the overall game. So you start with 200. You can go ahead and put together some pick'em slips, not only for today's game, but of course this upcoming weekend. Take advantage of the opportunity. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back tomorrow. Do not forget Saturday and Sunday live stream, both starting at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Hope to see you there. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.